said, you know, you got to check out the Mudsill theory. This was a speech by John Henry Hammond, or James Henry Hammond. I'll have to look it up to get the exact name right. That say what? James, thank you. That basically argues that society has to have a poor working class that is basically permanently locked into that position. This is the rationale of the caste system in India. It was the rationale used to justify slavery. In fact, Hammond was justifying slavery when he gave this speech in 1858 before the U.S. House of Representatives. And it is, I believe, what the Republican Party is doing right now. And let me just give you 3 data points that back this up. Number one, in the past 7 years, there has been a near 5-fold increase in documented child labor violations by employers. And the states are responding to this in 2 ways. Democratically controlled states, blue states, are making it harder for employees to hire children, or for employers to hire children. They're tightening their child labor laws. Red states, on the other hand, are reducing the strength of their child labor laws and, in fact, allowing children to work. The first to do this was Sarah Huckabee Sanders. And so this is basically bringing children into the workplace, number one. Number two, you have Republican-controlled states waging war against quality public education, against free education. The first shots were fired in efforts to strip our libraries and schools of books and curriculum that taught America's history of slavery, the story of Jim Crow, the Native American genocide, and the brutality against the queer community. These were often followed by violent or at least threatening appearances at school board meetings by militia members and white supremacists saying that they were calling out teachers for being woke. And most recently, a bunch of red states, Arizona, Arkansas, Florida, Indiana, Iowa, North Carolina, Ohio, Oklahoma, Utah, and West Virginia have all instituted universal voucher programs or something very close to that in an effort to basically kneecap their public schools. This is an effort that is being heavily funded by right-wing billionaires like Betsy DeVos and her buddies. And, you know, people are scratching their head. Why would Republicans want child labor? Why would they want to destroy our public schools? Well, if children aren't going to school, they're available to work, right? So there seems to be a correlation there. And then finally, why do Republican-controlled states go out of their way to make it hard to form a union or to join a union? And they certainly do. You look at the states with the highest level of social mobility, and you know, in other words, your child is more likely to do better economically than you. You look at the states where that is true, where there's high levels of social mobility, and with one exception or 2 exceptions, they're all blue states, excuse me. Maryland, Minnesota, Delaware, this is in order. Maryland, Minnesota, Delaware, Vermont, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Montana, and Utah. These are the states with the highest levels of social mobility. The states with and only one of them, only Utah, has a right to work for less state. And then you look at the states with the lowest levels of social mobility, where you are most likely to end up in the same social and economic class as your parents. And those states are Oklahoma, South Carolina, Alabama, Florida, Kentucky, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Texas, all right to work for less states. So, you know, if you notice a pattern here, right, it's basically an anti-worker, pro-child labor, end public schools. So what does this have to do with mudsills? Well, the mudsill is when you build a house, you pour the concrete for the foundation, or you make it out of bricks or whatever. And then on the top of that masonry foundation, you lay a sill, a layer of wood that is the bottom layer of the wood that connects the house above it to the platform or to the foundation below it. And that sill is called the mudsill. It's at the mud level, right? And back on March 4th, 1858, the plantation owner and South Carolina Senator James Henry Hammond stood up to give a speech to his associates in the House of Representatives. And he said this, he said, "In all social systems, there must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. That is a class requiring but a low order of intellect and but little skill. Its requisites are vigor, docility, and fidelity. He goes on to say that you must lock these people in, essentially. He says, such a class you must have, or you would not have that other class which leads progress, civilization, and refinement. It constitutes the very mudsill of society and of political government, and you might as well attempt to build a house in the air as to build either the one or the other, except on this mudsill. Now, Abraham Lincoln was very upset by this. On September 30th, 1859, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, he gave a speech. He was still a lawyer in private practice at the time, but people were contemplating the probability that he would be running for president soon. And he gave this speech. He said, he was talking about, the slave owners in the South. And he said, they further assume that whoever is once a hired laborer is fatally fixed in that condition for life. And thence again, his condition is as bad as or worse than that of a slave. This is the mudsill theory. And then he goes on to say, the opponents, he's speaking of himself here, he says, the opponents of the mudsill theory insist that there is not of necessity any such thing as the free hired laborer being fixed to that condition for life. There is a demonstration for saying this. Many of the independent men in this assembly, doubtless a few years ago, were hired laborers. And then he goes on to use this very, very famous quote that's almost never presented in the context of the mudsill theory. He said, another class of reasoners, again speaking of himself, hold that labor is prior to and independent of capital. That in fact, capital is the fruit of labor and could never have existed if labor had not first existed. That labor can exist without capital, but the capital can never have existed without labor. Hence, they hold that labor is the superior, greatly the superior, of capital. Now, Lincoln was also the first president of the United States to use the word union to describe labor unions in a speech, or in a number of speeches, actually. In fact, when the newspapers of the day reported on it, they always put the word union in quotation marks because it was such a new and novel thing. Lincoln also was a big believer in social mobility. This is why he signed the Morrill Act, which put, I believe it was the Morrill Act, which put over 73 or 74 land grant colleges into existence, where federal land was given to these colleges to use as they want. They could farm it, they could log it, they could sell it, they could do whatever they wanted with it to be able to subsidize the cost of tuition. My mom graduated from one of those schools, Michigan State University. It's a land grant college. It was created by Abraham Lincoln to be basically a free college. And Lincoln was a big fan of free or inexpensive colleges, and he created some 70 of them all around the country as his way of saying, no, I am not on the side of the mudsill theory. I am on the side of working class people and social mobility. So, how is it that the Republican Party is all in on the mudsill theory? Well, it turns out that back in the 1950s, 1951, Russell Kirk, the kind of, godfather of the modern conservative movement, wrote a book called The Conservative Mind, From Burke to Eliot. And in that book, he argues forcefully that the society must have, to use his words, classes and orders in order to function or ensure stability. He argued in the 1950s that if the American middle class ever got so wealthy that the middle class became more than half of us, which, by the way, happened in the 1970s, the late 60s, early 70s. He argued that if that ever happened, you would see three things. You would see young people ignoring their elders, not respecting their elders any longer. You would see racial minorities forgetting their, quote, place in society. And you would see women demanding equality with men. And all three of these things, according to Russell Kirk, would lead to social chaos and the destruction of our republic. And, when he first pitched this in the 1950s, he was largely laughed at by other conservatives. William F. Buckley and Barry Goldwater bought his theory and were proponents of his book, but The Conservative Mind. But most Republicans were like, we're still with Eisenhower. This was the 1950s, after all. This was my dad's Republican Party, the Eisenhower Party. But then the 1960s happened. The birth control pill was legalized in 1961. By 1964, 65, you had a full-on women's movement as a result of that. or facilitated in part by that anyway. The Vietnam War had become a touchstone, a point of contention for young people who did not want to go fight in a war that they felt was based on lies. And you had both racial minorities and gender minorities, the LGBTQ community and blacks and Hispanics, basically rising up and saying, no, we're not your slaves anymore, and we're not going to be second-class citizens any longer. Well, when that happened in the 60s, the Republicans looked around and said, holy cow, Russell Kirk was a prophet.
1 minute.
He accurately, predicted this. And so what do? Well, we've got to bring in a guy who's going to do three things. He's going to gut public education. And Reagan, came in 1981 with that mandate. And sure enough, right off the bat, he cut funding for colleges and for public schools by 20%, his first cut. And then there were other cuts to follow. It used to be that 80% of the tuition of college was paid for by the government. Now it's only 20%. That's the result of Reagan. So number one, he gutted our schools. Number two, he started dialing back on child labor laws, or the enforcement of them. And number three, he made it harder for unions to exist. He started by breaking up PATCO, the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, the Air Traffic Controllers Union, and then went after every other union. And by the time he was done, by the end of the Bush and Reagan administrations, we had gone from a third of us being unionized to only about 10% of us. And, that is the Mudsill theory. That is the Republicans pursuing this idea that there needs to be a permanent underclass, and that permanent underclass is probably best defined by race. And that is what Donald Trump is running on. I don't think most, working class Americans understand this, or if they do, they understand it as basically that part being defined by race part. In other words, the white Trump followers are quite excited about this. Oh yeah, let's put those black people back in their place, they're saying. It's grim.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
But that's the Mudsill theory that Lincoln pushed back on, and ironically now Republicans, his party, are advocating. What say you?